It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, as always, that means some smart talk radio is in your future. And we're certainly pleased to have with us this segment, Richard Rothstein. He's a research associate on the Economic Policy Institute and a fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He lives in California, where he is a fellow of the Haas Institute at the University of Cal Berkeley. Pleased to have him here. We're going to be talking about a brand new work called The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Mr. Rothstein, how are you, my friend?
Fine, thanks. Good morning.
Well, interesting subject indeed. Law, discrimination, how our government has contributed or not contributed to that situation has been long a preoccupation, so to speak, or certainly a subject of tremendous interest to you. Give our Lewis at Large listeners, if you would, just a little bit of your background and why this subject is so important to you personally.
Well, I spent many years studying education policy and writing about education policy. And one of the problems that I was frequently focused on, as is the country at large, is what we call the achievement gap, the difference in average achievement of African American and white children. And I came to realize that the largest cause of that achievement gap is the social and economic problems that some children come to school with. If a child is in poor health, for example, they're more likely to miss school, to be absent. African Americans, for example, have 4 times the rate of asthma that white children have, and they're more likely to come to school drowsy and less able to pay attention. And this affects their achievement. If a child comes from a family where the parent is unemployed and they're under economic stress, this affects their ability to achieve because of the stress that's involved. And I realized that when you have children like this, if they're in a school where not every child has these problems, a teacher can devote special attention to that child. But if they're in a school where every child has these kinds of social and economic challenges that interfere with their achievement, no teacher can give special attention to every child. The level of instruction inevitably declines. If children are coming to school in stress, their behavior is going to deteriorate. More time has to be spent in discipline. And so the achievement gap was largely the result of these kinds of problems that are concentrated in schools where so many children have these problems. And the reason the schools have these kinds of concentrations, the reason the schools are segregated, is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. And so I began to look into how these neighborhoods came to be segregated, because I understood that unless we can desegregate neighborhoods, we can't desegregate schools. And if we can't desegregate schools, we're never going to raise the achievement of disadvantaged African American children in particular to the levels that we hope to achieve in America.
Do you find a lot of differences in this same situation, in these same circumstances, depending on parts of the country, or was it pretty universal?
No, it's universal, and what I found in the course of this research is that the federal, state, and local governments created segregation in every metropolitan area, in the north, in the Midwest, in the west, in the central states, as well as in the south. This was not an accident. It was not something that happened because of private prejudice. Federal, state, and local governments' policies segregated metropolitan landscapes in every metropolitan area, and these were unconstitutional, because it's one thing if segregation happened because of private prejudice. But if it happened because the federal government in particular, and state and local governments as well, purposely segregated neighborhoods, then it's a violation of the Constitution. And so learning this history of how the federal, state, and local government segregated America led me to believe that if we understand this history, we'll understand that it's unconstitutional. We'll understand we have a constitutional obligation to reverse it, to remedy it.
Let me ask you this question, and this is not a challenging one. It's one more probing, and I'd like to get your opinion on this. What you're talking about, a lot of our listeners I know are thinking he in some ways stating the obvious, although with a lot more research clearly behind it. This issue doesn't sound new. What is, in the color of law and the research you've done recently, what new things did you find out, or did you basically kind of confirm what many people have already thought?
Well, I wish many people had already thought this, but in fact it's not the case. We have a national consensus shared across the political spectrum today that we have something called de facto segregation. That the reason that neighborhoods are segregated is because of private prejudice, because real estate agents may have steered families to neighborhoods of the same race, perhaps because African Americans didn't have adequate incomes to move into middle-class communities. That's what is called de facto segregation, and the Supreme Court has said that the reason that neighborhoods are segregated is because of these millions of these personal prejudicial decisions, and therefore it's not a constitutional violation. Very few people today, it was once well known, but very few people today understand how the federal government purposely, as a matter of public policy, segregated metropolitan areas in a way that never could have happened from private prejudice or from the actions of individual real estate agents and so forth. And my purpose in writing this book was to reacquaint members of the public with this history, which was never hidden. It was all quite explicit in the mid-20th century, but we've all forgotten about it. And if I may, I'll give you some examples. In the mid-20th century, the New Deal particularly, that began when Franklin Roosevelt, took office in 1933, there was an enormous housing shortage in the country. It was a housing shortage not for African Americans only, but for whites, for middle-class whites, for working-class whites who had lost their homes in the Depression. So the federal government began a public housing program. And it was intended for middle-class, for working-class whites, primarily. Some projects were for African Americans as well. But the federal government segregated these housing projects by policy, not implicitly. It's not that African Americans happened to apply to some projects and whites happened to apply to others. It's they were labeled by race in the North, in Boston, in New York, in Pittsburgh, in Chicago, in Detroit, everywhere in the country. And that's how, and this happened often in cities where there had never been segregation before. So in my book, for example, I talk of the great African-American novelist and poet Langston Hughes, whose autobiography tells how he grew up in an integrated neighborhood in Cleveland. Many neighborhoods in urban areas were integrated in those days because workers didn't have cars, and so workers of all ethnicities and races had to be able to walk to their factories or other workplaces, and they had to live close with one another. He grew up in an integrated neighborhood. He tells of how his best friend was Polish, and he dated a Jewish girl in high school. The federal government in the 1930s came into that neighborhood where Langston Hughes grew up, cleared it, and built segregated public housing, imposing a segregated pattern on Cleveland that had not previously existed. And this happened in city after city across the country. The same thing happened in World War II. In World War II, millions of workers flocked to defense production centers. That was the main source of new employment, was building bombers, building tanks, building jeeps. Workers, white and black, came to urban centers to work in defense plants. In many cases, they came to urban centers that had no African-American populations before that, so there was no previous pattern of segregation. The federal government built separate public housing projects for defense workers in city after city across this country. In Richmond, California, for example, which was the largest shipbuilding center in the country, a deep-water port across the bay from San Francisco. In that community, there were very few, almost no African Americans living before the war. By the end of the war, there were 15,000 housed in projects built by the federal government along the railroad tracks in an industrial area, while white workers who also came to Richmond to work in defense plants were housed in projects in residential areas. The Willow Run Bomber Plant, well known in Michigan, was built on a site that was rural. Nobody was living there of any race. But the federal government built housing for white workers only for the Willow Run Bomber Project. If African Americans wanted to work in that project, they had to commute from Detroit. So this was an imposition of segregation by federal policy that would not have arisen otherwise. Then, in the 1950s, we had a situation where everywhere in the country, housing projects where whites lived had large numbers of vacancies. Housing projects where African Americans lived had long waiting lists. And the reason for that was another New Deal program by the Federal Housing Administration, where they guaranteed bank loans to mass production builders of subdivisions, of suburbs, surrounding every city in the country, on explicit federal condition that no homes be sold to African Americans, and that every home built have a deed that included a clause that prohibited resale to African Americans. So whites were subsidized to move out of cities into all-white suburbs by federal design, while African Americans had to remain in cities and not permitted to move to the suburbs. Eventually, the situation of vacancies in white projects and waiting lists in black projects became so conspicuous that all public housing was open to African Americans. So industry left the central cities, so the people living there became poorer and poorer, and eventually public housing became the kind of thing that we're familiar with today, a low-income project for people who didn't have jobs or had very low-paying jobs. That's not how it started. But these two programs, segregated public housing and the subsidization of suburb construction for whites only, were the two major causes of segregation in every metropolitan area that we see today.
Do you, well, listen, before we go any further, if you just joined us, you're listening to yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. Got a good one going here with Richard Rothstein, the well-known research associate of the Economic Policy Institute and a fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He is a fellow of the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley, has written extensively on this subject. Richard, question for you. What about those out there, cynical or not, that say they can point to dozens, if not hundreds, of federally funded urban housing projects that are now in complete and utter decay and ruin? Is that part of this issue? And if so, what can be done in the future to change it so that this disparity and this gigantic chasm and gap starts to close?
Well, you're absolutely right. You know, when federal housing, public housing was built, as I said, beginning in the 1930s, the families who lived in those projects paid the full cost of their upkeep and maintenance and capital costs. These were not subsidized projects. The projects became subsidized and for low-income families only when whites depopulated them because they were subsidized to move out of public housing projects into the suburbs. And the only people who remained were African Americans, and then as industry moved and left the suburbs as well, the people living in those projects became poorer and poorer. Eventually, the federal government started to kick out people who could afford to live in the projects and pay their own rent, including maintenance workers, for example, so that they were no longer living in the projects that they took care of. Less money was spent to maintain the projects. Upkeep was ignored, and the projects deteriorated and became high-rise slums, vertical slums. That's not how it began, and it became this way only because of the segregation that the federal government imposed by subsidizing middle-class families, white families, to leave the projects and move to suburbs. How can this be reversed? Well, for one thing, we need to figure out how to reverse the segregation of the suburbs, which African Americans could have afforded to move to 40, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and are now unaffordable. The fact that working-class families can no longer afford to middle-class suburbs, which they could have afforded to move to, if blacks could have afforded to move to when they were first constructed, is a problem that needs to be remedied. The The best known of these mass production suburbs that were created in the 1940s and 50s is probably one in New York called Levittown. Perhaps your listeners have heard of it. It was 17,000 homes built in suburban New York by William Levitt and his family. Levitt could never have afforded to construct 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers on his own. He could not have assembled the capital to do so. He was able to assemble the capital only because the federal government guaranteed his bank loans on condition that he sell no homes to African Americans. He built this project for 17,000 white families. They sold at the time for about $7,000, $8,000. This was about twice national median income. Workers, returning war veterans, black or white, could easily have afforded to buy a home for twice national median income, especially if they had a FHA or VA mortgage, which at reduced interest rates would have made the homes even more affordable. Today, those homes in Levittown and in every subdivision like that across the country that was subsidized by the federal government, homes there now sell for $300,000, $400,000, about 7 times national median income. What once would have been affordable as an integrated development in the 1940s and 50s is now unaffordable to working class and middle class families. So the problem of remedying this is much more complicated than it would have been not to do it in the first place. But the fact that it's a difficult thing to remedy is not an excuse for not developing policies to desegregate the segregation that the government created. One of the things I say in my book is letting bygones be bygones is not a constitutional policy.
Right. What about in the research that you did and also just your own personal and professional observations, what about during the 8 years of the Obama administration? Did you see a situation that was at least being tended to more, possibly with a more aggressive attitude, or less, or the same? Any changes within that administration?
Very small changes. And the reason is, I'm repeating myself a little bit, the reason is that because we have forgotten how these neighborhoods, metropolitan areas, were segregated by government policy and unconstitutionally, and we think it happened naturally, we don't have either the motivation or the legal ability to reverse it. So the Obama administration took some very small steps. They passed a rule called the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Law rule, which required suburbs to assess the extent to which they were segregated and come up with plans to reverse it. They did this towards the end of the administration. There's no way of knowing what the administration would have done had suburbs refused to take steps to desegregate. So it was a very small step, but it's a step that is not being continued by the Trump administration. Ben Carson, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, reacted to this Obama administration rule by saying that requiring suburbs to assess the extent to which they're segregated and take steps to reverse it is a form of social engineering. And this is a good example of what I'm talking about. What Ben Carson did not understand is that this rule of the Obama administration was an attempt to reverse social engineering that had created the segregation in the first place. All through the 1930s and 1940s and 50s and into the 60s, the federal government was engaged in a social engineering program to segregate the country. And these very modest steps that the Obama administration was taking was an attempt to reverse social engineering, not to create it.
At this time, are there any potentially landmark court cases or anything, any challenges moving through that might not necessarily stem the tide, so to speak, but might be a line in the sand maybe where things might start to change?
Well, there are a few, but they're very, very modest, and we need much more conversation nationally about the origins of this problem before we're really able to attack it aggressively. So, for example, there are some cities in the country where it is prohibited to discriminate against families, who are mostly African American, because they have vouchers that the federal government has given them to help them afford rent in apartments outside areas of concentrated poverty. But in most parts of the country, landlords can refuse to accept those vouchers, meaning that African Americans who receive these vouchers, they're called Section 8 vouchers, can only use them in already segregated neighborhoods. So more states and jurisdictions adopting this policy of prohibiting discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders would be a big step. There was a court case 2 years ago. The Supreme Court found that in a case of Texas, for example, where a program called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, a federal program administered by the federal government that permits developers to get a tax subsidy for constructing units for low-income families, that it could be a violation of the Fair Housing Act to place those kinds of projects almost entirely in already segregated neighborhoods. And the Supreme Court said that this could be a violation of the Fair Housing Act. And after the Supreme Court issued its decision, the state of Texas began to permit these housing tax credits to be used much more in middle-class neighborhoods, in middle-class suburbs, than it had previously. So these are two very small steps that could be taken and are being taken. But much more needs to be done, and it won't be done unless we understand we have a constitutional obligation to do them.
What about, this is a little bit of an off step here, but what about the obvious rise in immigration in the country? Tell us how that has affected this situation, either exacerbated, made it worse, or added to it.
Well, I think there are two entirely different problems. Immigrants to this country, whether they were Irish or Italian or Polish or Jewish or Asian or Hispanics, have always lived, when they first came here, in low-income neighborhoods. They were poor. They were working at jobs that paid low wages. They needed to live in neighborhoods where their language was spoken and where they could gradually acculturate to America. So there are certainly neighborhoods of concentrated poverty where immigrants live. And gradually, over the generations, those immigrants have moved out and integrated into the broader population. We no longer have Irish and Italian and Jewish ghettos in this country. But the only group that has been segregated by such explicit federal policy has been African Americans. So these are two entirely different situations. African Americans aren't living in areas of concentrated disadvantage because they don't know the American English language, because they need to acculturate to American values. They're living there because they were constricted by government policy to those neighborhoods. That's a very different situation from those of immigrants.
You know, as you did the research and as you look around the landscape now, is there a group, be it a political group, socioeconomic group, any group of leadership, so to speak, that is trying in some way, shape, or form to lead the charge to change this? I know you've done a lot of research and you're trying to shed light on things, but are there others out there that are proactively working to get this thing changed?
Yes. The first step to get it changed is to reacquaint people with this history, because, as I said, so long as we think it happened by accident, we're only going to think it can be undone by accident. If we understand that it happened by explicit, aggressive federal policy, we can understand that equally aggressive policy is necessary to remedy it. And there are other people besides me who are writing about this. Ta-Nehisi Coates, a writer in the Atlantic magazine, has done some terrific pieces exploring this history. A writer for the New York Times magazine, Nicole Hannah-Jones, has also been writing about it. And I hope more and more people will write about it to reacquaint the country with this history. One of the scandals, I think, that I uncovered and I talk about in the book is the fact that high school textbooks across the country lie about this history. Not only do they talk about the northern segregation as being de facto, but they don't even mention these very explicit federal policies in the New Deal that segregated America. So one of the first things we need to do is to address high school curricula and make sure that the next generation is taught an accurate history of how we came to the place we're in. Because if the next generation doesn't understand it, they will do no better a job than we have in desegregating the nation.
Well, the subject is a deep one, long discussed, and will be quite some time, if not forever, into the future. The subject is segregation. The work is called The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America by Richard Rothstein, again, a research associate on the Economic Policy Institute, as well as a fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, also a fellow at the Haas Institute at the University of Cal Berkeley. Richard, how can people find out more about some of the writings that you've done and maybe pick up a copy of the book?
Well, the book is called The Color of Law, and it's available online as well as online sellers like Amazon or Barnes & Noble and independent bookstores. I have a website at the Economic Policy Institute, which is www.epi.org, and there's a list of experts. There's a bar with a pull-down menu of experts at that site, and if you go to my name, you'll find many articles I've written about this topic, as well as more information about the Color of Law book.
Well, we very much appreciate your expertise and your observations and sharing some time with us today. Best of luck with the book, and would certainly like to have you back on again to talk about some follow-up with this.
Well, thank you very much. I will be in Kansas City in a few months, and perhaps I'll see you then.
Good to know. All right, we will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.